Hello guys, it's Chris and welcome back to the Watch Scientists channel. In this video, I'll be doing an unboxing and a review of the Timex Q Reissue from 1979. At the end, I will also mention 5 things I like and 5 things I don't like to change things up a little bit. This watch was a big hit at the end of 2019 and I got mine in December last year. So this is not an original first look unboxing, as I like to familiarize myself with the watch to get a feel before I do a review. So, to get this video started, it would really mean a lot to us if you would subscribe to our channel, as we have interesting content coming for you soon. And please leave a like at the end of the video if you enjoyed it. If you have any feedback, we would love to hear about it in the comments down below. Now, as I mentioned, this is a reissue of an existing Timex watch from 1979. The Timex Q, at the time, brought the modern quartz technology to a new generation, as the 80s were marked by the so-called Quartz crisis. The original Timex Q was a result of the revolutionary period in the watchmaking industry. During this time, quartz technology was threatening traditional mechanical watchmaking. Many established watch companies were on the brink of extinction, as it seemed that especially Asian watchmakers found a more efficient and cheap way to tell the time correctly. Timex was able to jump on the quartz train soon enough with the likes of the Timex Q in 1979, bringing the quartz watches to the masses. Other American brands like Hamilton didn't manage to adapt to the changing circumstances and were bought up by another company. The very first quartz watches were hugely expensive, the Seiko Quartz Astron being the first production quartz watch released at the very end of 1969, costing as much as a small car. It was made out of gold, but still, that's not how you convince a consumer world of a new technology. On the other hand, a company like Timex, making watches for the everyday man and women, bringing out an affordable quartz watch is much more of a compelling argument for this new technology. And thus, Timex proudly shows off that they have a quartz movement inside, with the big letter Q on the top at the 12 o'clock marker and the quartz writing at the 6 o'clock marker. Surprisingly, now looking at this watch, this actually was a diving style watch at the time. This really shows how the design of watches has changed since back then. This small, intricate and pretty light watch is a far cry from today's big and flashy sports watches with their 40+ mm cases, often weighing over 170 grams. In this sense, this is a real revival of the 1979 original, as Timex stayed really close to the classic, right down to the typical battery latch on the case back. This is very practical, as you can do your battery change with almost anything. As I show here, you can do it with a coin, for example. Easily opening the case back, and here you can see the battery that this movement uses. The Timex Q was a reissue in 2019 for $179 with a limited stock, so it was quickly sold out. This was a pretty good strategy from Timex, in my opinion, because it generated a lot of hype around the watch and it became one of the most talked about watches at the end of 2019. After the first batch, Timex restocked their shop a few times, almost always selling out within the first day. The last time they restocked, when I bought my watch, it lasted a little bit longer, but the watch is currently out of stock again. The cheapest new one I could find on Chrono24, for example, was at 190 euros, and then the next examples were over 200 euros. This is a nice little bit of appreciation considering the price class this watch is in. So, when I opened the box for the very first time, the vintage styling of the Timex Q immediately stood out to me. For example, the domed acrylic crystal giving some nice distortions, as well as the faux patina on the minute markers and hands, and the typical 70s style mesh metal bracelet are particularly responsible for this vintage feel and look. Timex did a really good job capturing that 70s styling. The lightly faded blue dial also contributes to this look. The domed acrylic crystal gives many interesting distortions when looking at the watch from an angle. The smaller case size with its 38.3mm and the surprisingly light 90 grams this watch weighs accurately represent the watch styling of the time. Back then, watches were already starting to grow in size compared to the early 20th century wristwatches, but were still well under 40mm. Nowadays, one could say the ideal size for most watch enthusiasts ranges from just under 40mm to 42mm. The watch is generally made out of stainless steel and has a polished finish overall on the case, as well as a brushed finish here on the edges. The watch has a thickness of 12mm, but the domed crystal makes up 0.5 millimeter of that, so the watch definitely seems thinner and sits nicely on the wrist. To get this domed vintage look, it's way easier and cheaper to use acrylic glass instead of sapphire. Although it must be said that the acrylic glass scratches more easily, it is possible though to even out small scratches by polishing it with a product like Polywatch. The watch has a 50 meters water resistance, which you can see indicated on the case back. This kind of water resistance can be expected with a crown like this that is not screw down. The watch sits on a metal mesh bracelet with a hook style clasp, as often seen on Casio watches. In my opinion, this is a little bit difficult to close, especially when you just have one hand to put on your watch. The lug tip to lug tip width is 45mm and the lugs themselves are 18mm wide. In case you want to put a different strap or bracelet on this watch, it's just important to make sure it fits this watch, as it doesn't have the typical style lugs you're normally used to. As you can see here, the Timex Q has a 3-hand movement with a day-date complication. This, in my opinion, is a very practical complication to have. Again, I always find myself looking at these distortions. I just love how they look. Thankfully, the movement inside is a Seiko PC33, which makes it considerably less noisy. The ticking on a Quartz watch can become very annoying when you have an older movement, which was the case with some older Timex models. Here I will quickly show you how to remove the case back. You have to simply remove these 4 screws and you can look inside. It is quite a small movement, which is often the case with these Quartz movements. Here you can see the Seiko PC33 movement ticking away inside. One of the standout features of this watch, which I haven't touched on yet, is obviously the blue and red aluminum bezel. This is a very popular color combination in the watch industry at the moment, with the likes of the Rolex GMT Master 2 BLRO, aka the Pepsi, leading the lineup. If you ever wondered, by the way, BLRO stands for Bleu and Rouge, which means blue and red in French. Other watches that have this kind of color combination include the Tudor Black Bay GMT and the Tag Heuer Aqua Racer GMT and many others. These colors work well together as they are complementing colors in the color gradient circle. Also, GMT watches have the bezel normally indicating 24 hours to make it more visually obvious if it's nighttime or daytime in your chosen second time zone. This not being a GMT watch, however, this only displays 12 hours on the bezel, but the color combination is still stunning. GMT watches are useful to keep track of time in a different time zone, but as this watch doesn't have that second GMT hour hand, the bezel here is more stylish than functional. As I promised earlier, I am now going to mention 5 things I like and 5 things I dislike about this watch. Starting with the 5 things I like. My number one is the overall size and proportions of this watch. I like watches under 40mm, with some exceptions of course. For me, 38mm is a sweet spot for a watch, and the 12mm thickness, looking at it here on my wrist, really fits my wrist nicely, and I like it when the watch sits a little more flat. Number two on the list is the popular Pepsi look. This red and blue color scheme is very popular right now in the watch industry. These colors complement each other nicely and offer some nice flash of color in your watch collection, which, to be honest, can get dull sometimes. So, talking about the watch industry, number three on my list is the history this watch represents. This watch really interests me, although I generally prefer mechanical watches because of the extensive ingenuity and craftsmanship that goes into them. But I also like to remember the Quartz crisis, as it represents a turning point in watchmaking history. And even though Quartz technology offered a cheaper and arguably more reliable way to tell the time, we still to this day appreciate the skill it takes to put together a bunch of gears in order to tell the time correctly, which I always find fascinating. The next thing on our list is the day-date complication. The day and date complication is one of the most useful complications in my opinion, as we mostly use the day of the week or the date of the month as a reference for current events. Moon phases and month or year indicators are great feats of watchmaking, but let's be honest, when did you last ask yourself what month or what year it is or in what phase the moon is at the moment? As this is a normal day-date complication and not an annual calendar, it needs adjustment from time to time, as the watch doesn't know which month it is and thus doesn't know when there's 30 days in a month or 31 days. The annual calendar movement, by the way, has a special programming gear so that your watch knows when a month has 31 days and when it has 30 days. Lastly, I really love the overall vintage vibe of this watch. I think they did a really good job capturing that vintage style, which I really enjoy sometimes, with the dome crystal giving some cool looking distortions, the lightly faded blue dial and the faux patina on the markers and hands. I think Timex did a really good job making all these design cues come together, forming a consistent vintage vibe. Now, starting with the 5 things I don't like. The most obvious downside of this watch is definitely the bracelet. For the guys out there or anyone having arm hair, most noticeably this bracelet is gonna rip out your hair from time to time. It might get better if you strap the bracelet on a little tighter, because the watch won't move around that much. At this point, I would also like to mention that with the size and the color, this watch would also look great on the wrist of a woman. Not that women can't wear what they want, obviously everyone can wear what they want, but I feel like this would fit nicely, so let me know in the comments below what you think. Talking about the bracelet, this brings me to number 2, the case-bracelet gap. This transition between the case and the bracelet could have been done a little more continuous. The bracelet could have been integrated better, giving it a more fluent design. This gap breaks up the flow in my opinion, and I think they could have done it better. Number 3 on the list is the bezel. It is a frictionally moving bidirectional bezel, which means it turns without clicking, as you can see here, and it does this in both directions, hence bidirectional. I feel like it's less precise and satisfying than a clicking bezel, although as this bezel is mostly stylish, this isn't really much of a downside. Another thing I'm not so fond of is number 4, the clasp they used on this watch. I don't like this type of clasps. It's a little hard in my opinion to put the watch on, as I've struggled numerous times during this video, especially when you're doing it with one hand while putting your watch on. I also feel like this kind of clasp is not that secure. As you can see here, something tugging on the latch would open up your watch and your watch falls to the ground. Talking about your watch falling to the ground, the last negative I would like to mention is the acrylic crystal. I know I said I like the dome crystal, and I really do, but a small downside of acrylic glass, like I said, is that they attract scratches more easily. Not only because the acrylic crystal is softer than sapphire crystal, but also, as in this case, it's a domed crystal, which means it attracts scratches even more. As you can tell, these are only minor negatives, but all in all, I really love this watch. Putting it on my wrist, I'm really happy with the smaller size and weight. This watch really wears comfortably. The hair pulling can be annoying though, and is for me the most prominent downside of this watch. That aside, this is a really fun watch with a very popular trendy look, showing off some vintage design cues as well as hinting towards the modern watch industry. I find it really interesting seeing the price of these stay relatively consistent, as this is not so usual for watches in this price bracket, but I will leave you on that one. That's it for today, guys. Again, thank you so much for watching these videos, it really helps a lot. Please leave a like and subscribe if you haven't done so already, and we will see you in the next one. Take care.